We're talking about this book here, Apocalypse Never. And so I'd like to also ask you, if you don't mind, about San Fransicko. What's that about?
I'm so excited. Yeah, I literally got home from Europe last night and this was waiting for me. It comes out on Tuesday. And this is a book that is the second part of this trilogy I'm working on about civilization, which Apocalypse Never was the first part of. And the book looks at how victim ideology is hurting people. Specifically, it's about drugs, crime, and homelessness in progressive West Coast cities, but also the problem is spreading. I point out that we have really good solutions to these problems, including open air drug scenes, which is the technical word for homeless encampments or these big sprawling tent cities where people are using meth and fentanyl and heroin and dying at huge numbers. While I've been focused on the environment, in the 1990s, I also worked on drug decriminalization and what's called harm reduction. I advocated for needle exchange, which is giving addicts clean needles so they don't get HIV/AIDS. And when I left that work around the year 2000, 17,000 people were dying from illicit drugs every year. Last year, 93,000 people in the United States died from illicit drugs. It's just brutal. It's barbaric. I'm very angry about this, sad and angry about what's happening to the place I live. I feel responsible, and I feel like I'm not living in a moral place. I feel like I'm living in a place that is depraved, where human dignity is being denied because we're so full of ourselves. We label people victims and then we let them harm themselves and we let them harm others, because a similar dynamic, which is that, because one of the questions is, how did people that say they care so much about poor people and people of color and the mentally ill and drug addicts, how did those people end up with cities where hundreds of people are dying from drug overdoses on the sidewalks every year? San Francisco is 713 people died last year from drug overdoses and poisonings. Why are we allowing this when we know how to deal with addiction, right? We have 100 years of experience with addiction. Why aren't we doing it? That was the question I wanted to answer in San Fransicko. Why does the left care so much about police killings of African Americans, but doesn't seem to do anything or care at all about the African Americans who are killed 30 times higher by civilians? Like, why? What is the selective outrage about? And so the book deals really
there's a question for a T-shirt. What is the selective outrage about? Wow, man, we could think about that for about 5 years, right? And everyone can apply that to themselves. It's like, well, you're outraged by some things, but not others that seem equally outrageous. It's like, okay, what's going on there exactly? Well, you can't be outraged about everything, but
Yeah, and the answer is that the progressives are outraged by what they see as victims of the system.
Yeah.
And then they're just sort of mildly bothered by victims of other individuals. So why do we let...
Well, that's domination by the Great Father, right? That's a psychological issue. Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you see there's these existential constants. And, Freud said, well, God was a projection of the Father. And that's what he thought it was just that. And I mean, he wasn't that shallow, but essentially that's the argument. It's like, yeah, well, there's some truth in that. Well, there's a negative element of that symbolic image. And that dominates some people's life. Other people are terrified of mortality itself. That's the negative aspect of the Great Mother. And we're all prone to that. And we don't understand it well, but it's there. And so the system is the tyrannical father. And make no mistake about it, like, there's a tyrannical father. That's the terrible dread weight of history. It's no joke. But it's one-sided. If you're completely preoccupied by that, especially under conditions of relative security, freedom, and all that, then, well, there's an unresolved psychological issue there at the bottom of your psyche that you should attend to before you get dangerous. So,
you were on my mind because there's a mother, Jackie Berlin, late 50s. Her son is a homeless addict. He could die any day. She's been trying to get him off the street. Of course, the city of San Francisco is not helping her. The laws are against her. Her son refers to San Francisco as Pleasure Island. And of course, I'm so familiar with your brilliant analyses of Pinocchio that you were on my mind while working on this, and also the ways in which I asked the question of, is this Munchausen syndrome by proxy? I ultimately conclude that that's probably too extreme of a framing, but it is pathological altruism. I feel comfortable with that.
Oh yeah, and that's the Freudian devouring mother, by the way, is pathological altruism. So imagine that you're a manifestation of a maternal force that says, I will protect my children at all cost. Okay, so they're in the basement in your arms. Well, who's the snake? You, right? In that terrible attempt, that ultimate attempt to make everything safe, right? Which in some sense is the goal of motherhood itself, right? Is that you become the snake. And I thought about this for a long time, and theologically as well. It's like, well, there's the Garden of Eden, right? And that's the symbolic story. And there's a damn snake in there. And it's like, couldn't God make a paradise without a snake? And the answer is no. And no one else can either. And if you don't know who the snake is, it's probably you. And the whole Freudian Oedipal nightmare is that devouring element of compassion, which we can't have a serious conversation about either. It's like too much compassion, man, infantilizes you. And there's no difference between that and death. It's the same thing. And the Freudians, to their credit, said the good mother fails.